Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors Land Use and Transportation Committee meeting for Monday, December 4th, 2017. My name is Mark Farrell. I will be chairing this committee. I am joined by our committee vice chair, Supervisor Aaron Peskin, as well as Supervisor Katie Tang. And we are also joined today by Supervisor Jeff Sheehy. I want to thank Elisa Samara, the clerk of our committee today, as well as Jim Smith and Jesse Larson from SF Gov TV for covering the meeting. Madam Clerk, do we have any announcements?
Yes, please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the December 12th Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Okay, thank you. Madam Clerk, would you go to item number 1?
Item number 1 is an ordinance amending the Public Works and Subdivision Codes to implement Charter Section 16.129, providing that the city shall maintain street trees and be liable for injuries and property damage resulting from the failure to maintain trees and making appropriate findings.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Colleagues, this item was sponsored by Supervisor Sheehy, so I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Supervisor Farrell. Good morning, colleagues. Today we are here to consider an ordinance amending the Public Works Code to implement Charter Section 16.129. In November of 2016, the voters passed Proposition E, which provides that the city shall maintain street trees and thus is liable for injuries and property damage resulting from the failure to maintain street trees. Prop E passed with almost 80% of the voters' support, and it set aside $19 million a year from the general fund for DPW to run this program, which went into effect July 1st, 2017. Thus, the Public Works Code needs to be updated to reflect the voters' intention, which is that the city will be responsible for maintaining our street trees. And I do want to give a shout out for my predecessor, now Senator Scott Wiener, for his leadership on Prop E. Under the Street Tree SF program, there's a 3-year holding time before the city is eligible to take over the tree. As we know, new trees are planted from a variety of sources, including individual property owners and developers. After 3 years, the city will look to see if the tree is established, meaning that it has met specific criteria to be accepted by the city. Simply, the Street Tree SF makes it possible that the city does not take on maintenance for trees before a designated time period and thus reduces the city's liability. When the city does accept the tree, then we are taking away the burden of tree maintenance from property owners. It's important that we continue to work to sustain a long-term vision and strategy for our street trees. This will help us achieve beautiful neighborhood streets and healthy environments. I'll now turn it over to Carla Short, the Superintendent of the Bureau of Urban Forestry, which is part of the Department of Public Works. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Supervisor. Carla Short, San Francisco Public Works. So we're here today to consider some proposed code changes as required by the ordinance to the Public Works Code. I'll just give very brief background to how we got here. As you all know, budget cuts to the city's tree care program over the last decade resulted in inadequate public resources to properly care for San Francisco's urban forest. As a result, Public Works began transferring maintenance responsibility to private property owners, a hugely unpopular but necessary initiative. San Francisco's urban forest plan provided a detailed accounting of the state of the city's street trees, and in short, it was lousy compared to other cities. The report provided recommendations for improving the situation. One of the key takeaways was to adopt a sustainable funding stream to provide Public Works with the resources needed to properly care for the city's 125,000 street trees. We looked at best practices in other jurisdictions and potential funding scenarios and came up with the proposal that appeared on the November 16 ballot as Proposition E. As the supervisor noted, the proposition was passed overwhelmingly by San Francisco voters. Street Tree SF guarantees Public Works $19 million a year in general fund money for street tree care without raising taxes. Street Tree SF went into effect on July 1, 2017, transferring maintenance responsibility of all the street trees to the city. The ordinance also includes a provision to protect the city from liability when inheriting more than 80,000 trees for maintenance on July 1. And essentially, if it was identified as an issue prior to the July 1 takeover, property owners do share some of the liability for that condition. It also required a code amendment to bring the Public Works Code in line with the new measure. And so that's where we are today. There are a few key changes to the code that I'll just highlight for you today. The obvious one is it eliminates the section that makes property owners responsible for maintaining the tree in the right-of-way adjacent to their property. And equally as important, it eliminates the provision that allows the department to relinquish maintenance responsibility to adjacent property owners. In addition, it formalizes the tree establishment agreement, as the supervisor noted, of 3 years and requires Public Works sign-off prior to acceptance of a new tree for maintenance by the city. So, for example, if a developer is required to plant a number of trees as a mitigation for their building project, the city will only accept those trees for maintenance after they've gotten established properly and we have inspected and determined that we will take them on for maintenance. It also adopts a process to allow property owners to opt out and hire a private contractor to perform street tree maintenance. We have many San Francisco property owners who have been taking great care of their trees over the years, and they would like the option to continue to do so. So the code change allows that. Another important provision from my perspective is it requires property owners who damage trees to take steps to repair the damage and to remain liable for the trees until the city determines that they are healthy and structurally sound. So if someone tops a tree and that results in damage to the tree, which is going to have a poor structure and be prone to limb failures, the city does not have to inherit that problem, and we can require them to structurally prune the tree and restore it to a structurally sound condition before we take maintenance responsibility back. And then it also adopts rules and standards for contractors performing work on city trees. Essentially, Prop E does not cover planting costs of new trees, so we will have to seek other funding opportunities to cover the costs of planting and establishing trees. But we hope to grow the urban forest by 50,000 new street trees over the next 20 years, as envisioned by the Urban Forest Plan. And the future vision of street trees in San Francisco, we hope, will look something more like this. And I am available to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Colleagues, any questions? If not, we can turn to public comment unless Supervisor Sheehy have more to add.
I think Dan Flanagan was going to be here, but I don't see him for Friends of the Urban Forest, so.
Okay.
Public comments.
Well, why don't we open this up to public comment then? Anybody wish to comment on item number 1?
I'm Gail Baugh. I'm president of the Hayes Valley Neighborhood Association, and we've been working with Carla and DPW on restoring the Octavia Boulevard, where the street trees have been neglected. I've also seen something similar on Divisadero and also perhaps potentially on Cesar Chavez, where there's center medians that have trees. And I'm not sure if I'm really asking the question of Carla, if those trees are covered by this new ordinance.
Carl.
Anybody else, hold on before we go, anybody else wish to publicly comment on item number 1? Okay, seeing none, public comments now closed. Supervisor Sheehy.
Those trees are covered, yes, Carla? All right.
Supervisor Peskin.
I just wanted to thank Ms. Short and her staff for getting up to speed on this long-awaited change of policy, and thank the voters and my then colleagues and former Supervisor Wiener for getting this thing before the voters and finally solving a many decades problem, and can't wait for it to be rolled out.
Okay, thank you very much. Supervisor Sheehy, any other questions? If not, colleagues, got to get a motion?
So moved.
Motion by Supervisor Peskin, move this item forward.
Mr. Chair, would you like to send this out as a committee report?
That would be terrific. So motion by Supervisor Peskin, send this item forward as a positive recommendation as a committee report, and we can take that without objection. So, colleagues, item number 2 is sponsored by Supervisor Breed, and I think we're waiting on her to get here. So why don't we go to items 3 and 4 first. So, Madam Clerk, what do you call item number 3?
Item number 3 is an ordinance amending the Transportation Code to permit motorized scooters and mopeds to park in designated motorcycle parking spaces and making appropriate findings.
Okay, Mr. Thornley is here.
All right,
Welcome.
let's see. I'll take this spot. I don't have a presentation to make for you, if you don't mind. I'll just give you a verbal. I'm Andy Thornley from the Sustainable Streets Division of the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. We've brought to the committee a little bit of legislative business. And pardon me, the sequence of things we are talking about the motorized scooters first, I believe. Let's see, let me verify that. So actually 2 items here. These are both mine. So these both have to do with shared mobility. The SF Municipal Transportation Agency, having watched with a small pilot how small changes to parking policy would support a shared electric moped system. We have Scoot Networks running such a system in the city. We tried about a year of relaxing time limits in resident permit areas. We decided from our analysis and listening to neighbors and your constituents that we should go ahead and create a permit. So we've now created a shared electric moped parking permit. For $325 a year, a qualified shared electric moped operator can get such a permit. And Scoot's mopeds are now all showing this wonderful blue permit. So take a look at that. In bringing that legislation to Division 2 of the Transportation Code, over which the MTA's Board of Directors have authority, we discovered that the parking infraction for parking in a marked motorcycle stall was not quite exactly right. Right now, in Division 1 of the Transportation Code, it's an infraction. You can get a citation if you park something other than a motorcycle in a motorcycle parking stall. Well, it's been the MTA's policy and practice for quite a long time that we allow mopeds, scooters, other motorized two-wheelers in motorcycle stalls. So we are asking for a very minor correction in the language of Division 1 in the infraction having to do with parking in a motorcycle stall. That's Section 7237. And we are proposing to add a couple of words to that so that you are now okay to park a motorized scooter or a moped or a motorcycle in a motorcycle parking space. It's taken me longer to describe this than the actual proposal legislatively, but in view of the fact that the MTA's Board of Directors does not have authority over Division 1, the Board of Supervisors does, we respectfully request that the Board of Supervisors make that change to Division 1.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Would you mind, Mr. Thornley, just kind of for members of the public, because we get the question sometimes, the difference between where we are today, where we've been kind of the last year, and what we're, if you're approving now?
Right. So where we've been, we have had now since June of this year, the MTA has had a permit program in place for a qualified moped sharing organization such as Scoot Networks. Currently, they are the only one recognized by the MTA, but for an operator of shared electric mopeds, you may seek permits. The permits are $325 a year. The permit exempts a moped bearing that permit from a few parking regulations. You may first park in a resident permit area and not worry about time limits. You can also leave that moped in a metered motorcycle stall and not pay the meter at the motorcycle stall. And then thirdly, you can park that moped between vehicles in conventional parking spaces, metered spaces, and not have to pay the meter. That last one we get raised eyebrows about. You're saying I can park my moped in between two parked cars parked on Polk Street at a meter. The answer is yes, that's been legal for quite a while. You're able to share one or the other of the stalls with your Vespa or your Harley. That's already legal, as long as you're not obstructing traffic. But if you are the fellow on the Vespa and you pull up at that meter and it's not paid, you have to pay. Else, when the parking control officer comes, you're all in jeopardy of getting a ticket. So this permit simply forgives the moped from having to pay the meter. It basically liberalizes access to parking for qualified mopeds. And again, that's $325 a year for that permit. And the cleanup that we're bringing to you for your help is the infraction for parking your own Vespa or a shared Vespa in a motorcycle stall, strictly speaking, isn't legit right now, even though for decades the MTA and DPT have permitted motorcycles and mopeds and scooters from parking in motorcycle stalls. So this is really just some good housekeeping on the infraction that if you parked a Humvee at a motorcycle meter, you'd get a ticket. We're just opening up that infraction to say you can park a motorcycle or a moped so that we can take a permit and exempt the electric moped from that.
Got it. So a question for you. Have there been many people, aside from Scoot, who and I'll get to in a second, have been working with that have applied for or gotten these permits, or that you anticipate coming?
We have not had a second party interested in this. Sort of surprised. I expect at some point we'll have a second and third.
Yeah.
This is not unlike the stationless bike share systems that the board has talked about and worked on. At this point, it's just Scoot Networks who are operating. And they have, as I say, 570 of these permits in effect.
Got it. Yeah, and again, we've talked about this before, but I think my concern has been big parking spot or a parking spot, and forget it in residential zones, and they come in and park in the middle of those spots. So now you're actually taking away parking spots for people in neighborhoods who rely on that when they come home from work.
Right.
And Scoot has actually been very good to date to work together with them to try and alleviate that as much as possible, and I've appreciated their willingness to work together. I guess my fear would have been, had there been a ton of them and there's no working relationship with them, that would kind of get exacerbated, but potentially that's not the case at this point.
Indeed, Supervisor, that's our sentiment as well, that having this relationship with Scoot and having a permit sort of binds us to them and lets us, they've been good players all along, and I think working with the District 2 office, we've had good fortune. We find this appealing because it's an interesting and a policy positive mode to get around, but also to have a relationship that is built on this kind of a bind or a bound, we're bound together. Lets us have a little more control.
Okay, thanks. Supervisor Peskin?
Thank you. It's with regard to the fee per vehicle, which I assume has to pass the Prop 26 cost recovery
Correct.
test. So how did you determine the cost, and how often is that fee nexus audited for accuracy?
Well, this is just only our first fiscal year, so we're only a few months into this permit, but the cost recovery calculation includes lost meter revenue, administrative cost, my time and some other folks' time, and a little bit of enforcement time. But as you know well, it's hard sometimes to gather up expenses to make a politically palatable cost. There are some folks who would say it should be much more than that.
So how much of the fee is dedicated to the admin side, your involvement time-wise, and how much, you said a little bit for enforcement, how much?
Yeah, it's mostly lost meter revenue, and the other half is administrative time. So, and I think we projected as many as 1,000 permits times $325 for a year. We will certainly be auditing and truing up when we come around the corner into next fiscal year with real data to look at what's the actual cost that we've incurred.
Well, enforcement is very important, or none of these things work. It sounds like you're getting off to a better start than you did in the case of allowing Google buses to use our bus stops relative to that fee calculation, but let's look at it in a year.
Supervisor Tang?
Thank you very much. So I think our neighborhood had a little bit of a struggle when companies like Scoot first came to the neighborhood, and I say this as someone who rode a scooter, and I love scooters, and I love that it's an electric moped that they're using. But certainly when they were directing people to just flood certain neighborhoods with parking, and even though it was like the little sliver in between driveways that's legal, it really was creating a situation for neighbors where it was difficult for them to get in between, two mopeds to get into their driveways and so forth. And so I am glad that there are new strategies in place now. I am wondering, was there any analysis around the fact that these mopeds will now be able to park in motorcycle parking spots, whether there's ample parking for motorcycles that are paying to use them?
Right. It's a great question. Right now, there's a finite supply of motorcycle parking. the MTA, places motorcycle parking not in a systematic, premeditated way, but in response to demand. And so your constituents, for instance, will tell us, I'm really having trouble. There are 3 of my neighbors with motorcycles, and we will strike motorcycle stalls in response to that. Obviously, opening up space, making it more accessible for mopeds and scoots, right away we're paying more attention to, do we need to strike more motorcycle parking? And we're looking for supervisor offices and constituents to let us know that it's gotten tight. We know, for instance, at the Caltrain station at 4th and Townsend, it's always been contentious there, and so we're going to be making sure that we provide more parking at that location. But to Supervisor Peskin's point, balancing, paying attention to how much paid motorcycle parking is Scoot using so that we can true up the permit cost, more importantly, to provide all constituents access to that parking without throwing the balance off. So, excellent question. We're paying attention, and please, you and anyone watching at home, if you see a need for motorcycle parking, 311 it in, and we'll get it on the list.
Okay, thank you. I do look forward to a further analysis on this.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If no other questions, we'll open this up to public comment. Anybody wish to comment on item number 3? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Colleagues, could we take the same house, same calls? And it is listed as a committee report. No, it's not. So not a committee report, though. Okay, otherwise, same house, same call? So moved. Are you ready with 2? Okay, Madam Clerk, with that, would you go back to item number 2?
Item number 2 is a resolution imposing for 18 months interim zoning controls to limit off-street parking for new development and to remove the possibility to apply for CU authorization to increase such parking in the area known as the Hub or the Market Street Hub, and making appropriate findings.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. This item was, again, sponsored by Supervisor Breed, and who has just joined us in committee, so I will turn it over to her. Nope. One minute while we get our microphone sorted out.
There we go. Thank you for your patience. Colleagues, today I'm presenting legislation that will impose interim controls for the Market Street Hub area, also known as the Hub. The Hub is the most eastern side of the Market Octavia plan and includes the intersection of Market Streets with Valencia, Haight, and Goff Streets. It's currently being amended by the Planning Department called the Hub Project to better reflect the needs of one of the most dense and transit-rich areas in the city. The Hub Project provides us an opportunity to better ensure that the area's growth supports the city's goal for housing, transportation, the public realm, and the arts. Recently, there was a CEQA appeal of a high-rise proposal in my district, One Oak, located in the Hub. In the current iteration of the Market Octavia plan, developers can seek additional parking with a conditional use permit, and through One Oak was granted a CU for their parking. It really brought to light an important point about parking, and it relates to cumulative impacts along the Hub. As our city grows, buildings get built and our neighborhoods get more dense, the more crowded our streets get and the more impacted our services become. All of these developments for all this new parking has a cumulative impact. We know it and we see it, yet the guidelines that we use to measure impact say there isn't a significant impact. We all know that is flawed. So we as legislators have found our own ways of making sure that we're developing in a smarter, more sophisticated way. We're a growing city with the most expensive land in the country. We must be responsible about how we build. In the Hub alone, there are about 6 projects in the pipeline. Imagine if every single one of those asked for 136 parking spaces. Imagine what kind of impact that would have on traffic, which we all know in that particular corridor on Market and Van Ness, it is constantly backed up. This is a major transit-rich corridor. The traffic is crazy as is, and in the Van Ness BRT, all the delivery trucks and the Ubers and the Lyfts, and you get a big mess when you put all of those things together on a consistent basis. With planning amendments to with planning, what planning plans to do, we can't afford to have new projects moving forward in the interim with parking options that are counter to what is the ultimate goal of the hub and the Market Octavia plan. This legislation puts interim controls in place for the next 18 months until the hub project is complete. Specifically, it removes the conditional use option for additional parking for new developments within the hub area. Those already in the pipeline will be grandfathered in, but all new projects will have to work within these guidelines until the final hub area map is approved. This is straightforward, practical legislation that will help prevent new development from coming to the hub before we have a final plan, new parking, prevent new parking that will come to the area before we have a final plan in place. I have some clarifying amendments that we distributed. They're technical in nature. They further clarify that these interim controls are intended for new development and projects that have not received an approval of a development application prior to the effective date of this legislation. Happy to answer any questions, and I would appreciate your support. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Supervisor Breed. Supervisor Peskin.
So we have gotten a bunch of emails with regard to the exception on page 8, and Supervisor Kim has asked that we consider a compromise amendment that rather than exempting affordable housing projects that instead, and I've just passed this out to you colleagues, and I would support this amendment, that subsection B would read, will provide on-site affordable housing under the city's inclusionary affordable housing program, and then add where 25% of the residential units at the site are affordable as defined under Planning Code Section 401. So it kind of really requires a very robust affordable housing project before one can receive the exemption.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Breed, any comments?
I just have a question for Supervisor Peskin on the amendment. Do you know if any of the current developments in the hub are actually doing more than 25% affordable housing?
I believe that there is only one project, which is the former city-owned 30 Van Ness property that is proposing on-site affordable housing, and I do believe that that one is or is said to be 25%.
And just for clarity, your amendment will still require that if they want additional parking, they'd still have to go through a process and get a CU specifically for the additional parking.
So I believe the answer to that is current law, and that is not affected by the interim controls at all. So the answer to your question is yes, they would still need a conditional use.
So basically, they would have what they have based on my legislation by right in terms of if their percentage is 0.25, if their percentage is 0.40. And so what I'm doing with my legislation is requiring that there be no CUs granted, and you are adding an amendment to do an exception, and that exception would definitely require a CU.
No. Well, the currently the way your legislation reads, which I am a proud co-sponsor of, is that these interim controls shall not apply to any development that A, has received an approval of a development application prior to the effective date of this resolution, or B, will provide on-site affordable housing under the city's inclusionary housing program, period. And so this actually further defines that as at least 25% on-site affordable.
Thank you. And thank you, through the chair, to my co-sponsors on this legislation, to Supervisor Peskin and Supervisor Kim. And with that, I turn it back over to the chair. Thank you, Supervisor Farrell.
Chair Farrell, I'd like to move President Breed's amendments as well as Supervisor Kim's amendment that we just discussed, and once we take those amendments, would send the entire matter to the full board with recommendation.
Okay, we have a motion. Before we do anything, we will take public comment. Let me first do that. Anybody wish to comment on item number 2? Come on up. We'll have 2 minutes each.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tom Radulovich, Executive Director of Livable City. We just wanted to thank Supervisor Breed and her co-sponsors, Supervisors Peskin and Kim, for bringing this forward. You probably recall the TDM ordinance that you all approved a few months ago, and the findings for that showed that on-site parking, the amount of parking that a project provides, is the biggest single factor in how many automobile trips it generates. Now, we've seen kind of through the rezoning with the Market and Octavia plan and some proposed spot rezoning at the hub, a huge amount of development coming in here. High-density automobile-oriented development is untenable. But what we've also seen is a real abuse of this conditional use process. Conditional use requires findings of necessity and desirability, and then excess parking requires an additional 6 findings per section 304 of the planning code. It's 303, sorry. These get abused all the time. So basically the only criterion the planning department has been using for excess parking is, did the developer ask for it? That's not protecting the public. That's generating a terrific amount of automobile traffic in the downtown, in our transit corridors, and so on. So we think that closing this loophole in the hub is important. As of right, should be, that's all you get, right? It's either permitted or it's not permitted, since the CU is so badly abused. And we think less is better for automobile parking in the hub. Not only do you generate a lot of automobile trips, but there's also a lot of data showing that if you add parking to a unit, you increase the cost of that unit. So what we're allowing developers to do is we're allowing them to upscale projects, right? They can pitch projects in these transit-rich areas to a more affluent market and make them luxury products, whereas they might be a little more affordable without parking. So it's an affordability by design strategy to reduce parking. As we saw, that was included actually in the Home SF ordinance, and we'd like to see this applied in the hub and elsewhere.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Chair Farrell, Supervisors. My name is Jeremy Pollack here, speaking as an individual, and I would just associate myself with the comments of Mr. Radulovich largely. And I think one thing, though, I think would be helpful here is to get some input from planning and to look at the universe of projects that we're talking about to understand what the actual effect of this is. If I could have the overhead SF.gov TV. I've sort of done through my research, taken a look at what I could find, and I found 5 projects that were in the pipeline in the hub, 3 of which are requesting a CU for additional parking. And SF.gov TV, if you could show the overhead, that would be great. And so, looking at them, I see that 33 Golf is one project on the City College parcel where their preliminary project assessment shows that they're subject to an 18% BMR requirement. There we go. And so I think then we're looking at, and they're seeking a CU for an additional 130.
Jeremy, can you push that down just a little bit so we can see it?
Yep. Oh, wrong way. Not sure how well that's coming through. Right, so so basically we're talking about there are 3 projects seeking conditional use for an additional 400 parking spaces. I think at least one of them, 30 Otis is one that's not seeking the CU. The PPA says that it's already subject to the additional to a 25% BMR requirement. I think on-site affordable housing is an excellent idea whenever feasible, but I think this idea of trading parking for affordable housing seems problematic. And lastly, I would say just the uncertainty that this CU creates for developers and the public is really problematic. I think that's something we've heard over and over again in the housing debate.
Madam Clerk, because of the SFG TV problems, if you could please extend the speaker's time by 30 seconds.
Thank you, Supervisor. So I would just say the uncertainty that this CU process causes creates a lot of difficulty for developers and not knowing. I think developers look at this and they expect that they'll get that CU. The public that you hear from here looks at what's principally allowed and expects that that projects will abide by the 4-to-1 ratio, and I think it creates this uncertainty that is going to lead to each of these projects being debated again at the Planning Commission, which doesn't seem very helpful to us. I would urge you to just eliminate the exemption for affordable housing and clear up this process for all of us and save us all a lot of time. And thank you for your leadership on this, Supervisor Breed. I really appreciate your comments.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Andy Thornley speaking for himself. I thought I had timed my lunch break better, but we rearranged the agenda. So, Andy, the neighbor. Thank you, President Breed, for bringing this. Thank you, Supervisors Peskin and Kim, for co-sponsoring. I want to voice my support for the interim controls. I do want to echo what Tom and Jeremy and others have said, that I really do think it's important to not bring the loophole for on-site inclusionary forward. On-site inclusionary, very important. I would not argue against that. More BMR, absolutely. But to the extent that the city has existing policy and has found a junction between BMR and parking, it is that we incentivize developers by allowing them to provide less parking. Last year, we had a triumph at the board, unanimous approval of Home SF. And under the Home SF program, the local density bonus program, a developer is incentivized to add below market rate by getting some exceptions. And one of the key exceptions is that a developer can provide less parking as an incentive, down to a quarter of the principally permitted parking and down to zero parking at 100% affordable. So to the extent that this city and the Board of Supervisors have adopted a finding that associates below market rate with incentives for parking, it's to provide less parking, not more parking. So I urge you to support this interim control, but I really do urge you to drop the loophole for the on-site inclusionary. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, I'm Gail Baugh. I'm president of the Hayes Valley Neighborhood Association, and along with the appellant and the developer, we helped negotiate a settlement to get the CEQA appeal dropped. The conversation and the negotiations never included BMRs on site. It was only about the interim controls on parking. We have 4 sites in Hayes Valley that will be zero parking. They will be 100% affordable. So I don't quite understand the relationship to attaching BMR requirements to parking. I see them completely separate. I want to thank Supervisor Breed for bringing this forward. The interim controls are very important for all the reasons that she has mentioned, both now and in the past. And thank you for co-sponsoring this legislation. I do believe the amendment is irrelevant to the issue here, which is the cumulative effect of parking. Obviously, we need more affordable housing. But in terms of this CEQA appeal, there was no discussion about BMRs on site as a connection to allowing a developer to have additional parking. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. My name is Robin Levitt. For over 25 years, I've been living 3 blocks from the intersection of Market and Octavia. So I'm very concerned about additional parking in the area. As has been thoroughly discussed, parking brings congestion, it delays Muni service, it has very negative health effects, safety effects, and so forth. So I applaud the effort to put in these interim controls on future developments in the hub area. However, as much as I support affordable housing and laud the effort to add affordable housing to these projects, to compromise the environment and allow parking in exchange for that and all the congestion and so forth it would bring, I cannot support the amendment to this legislation. And so I urge you to pass the interim controls without the proposed amendment. There are already incentives in place, density bonuses, height increases to incentivize affordable housing in this area. We don't need to add parking as an incentive to build more affordable housing. We should find more ways, other ways to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if I may, just to the last speaker who I've known for many years, I think the amendment actually addresses not all of the concern, but the exemption is in the existing legislation. If we pass it as is, the exemption for affordable housing is in the existing legislation. The amendment that I'm offering on behalf of Supervisor Kim further narrows the applicability of that exception.
And I appreciate that, but I would eliminate the exemption altogether from the legislation.
Okay. I got you.
And also, I want to refer to a letter
Sir,
that I
I
sent
appreciate
you.
you've had your 2 minutes.
Okay.
You can send whatever. Thanks. Next speaker, please.
Hello, supervisors and chair. Karen Babbitt, just speaking for myself today. I came here prepared to ask that you eliminate the exemption for the on-site affordable housing entirely. I'm intrigued by what was introduced today by Supervisor Peskin on behalf of Supervisor Kim. However, in the time we've been talking, Supervisor Peskin mentioned one project that already had planned to do 25% below market rate on site. And then Jeremy mentioned a second project. So I would ask, this is my easy ask, we not send this to the full board today until we can actually look at how this proposed amendment, today's amendment, actually applies to what's in the pipeline. Just because I don't feel confident asking or saying this is great or not great until I can see what's actually planned. And so I'm going to repeat Jeremy's request. Can we hear from the planning department some kind of report? Much as I love his spreadsheet, it would be nice to have something official. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, supervisors, and thank you, Supervisor Breed, for sponsoring this legislation. As we look at the possibility of as many as 9,000 units going into a few block area here, we don't want to create any incentives to increase parking over the allowed amount for each area, each lot. So I would say we need to have a little more information about why Supervisor Kim has proposed this amendment. And I agree that when I read the legislation or the digest, I thought it exempted 100% affordable. So I'm confused at this point, but I request that this be delayed, a decision on this and forwarding it to the board be delayed until further clarification. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Jim Warshaw. I'm also with Hayes Valley Neighborhood Association, and once again, I'd like to thank Supervisor Breed, Peskin, and Kim for this excellent effort to improve our city. As all the speakers before have said, our objection really is with any exemption. It only creates confusion, and we believe that it is a much stronger document without it. As Gilboa mentioned, this was never part of the initial negotiation with One Oak. Furthermore, when you read, as I'm sure you all have, the Market Octavia CAC document to you with more whereases than I can possibly do in 2 minutes, they detail in painful detail why they also feel that there should be no loopholes or provisions for having the CU during this 18-month period for any of the non-approved projects. So I would once again, with all the other people who have spoken today, strongly recommend that we not move forward with the exemption in any shape or form. Should you, for any reason, decide to do that, Supervisor Peskin's comments are certainly very to the point of improving the originally submitted loophole, but I would even be much more strong in reiterating the necessity and desirability must be clearly demonstrated as a absolute provision of any CU. That's the piece that we seem to always lose with planning, and including that should you not decide to ban it outright and eliminate the exemption would be some protection. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to comment on item number 2? Seeing none, public comments now closed. I do understand, though, this amendment would be substantive, so we'll have to sit for a week anyways. I think it would be interesting to hear from our planning department or the sponsor of the amendment, whoever, if there is anything else in the pipeline that would be affected negatively or otherwise on this. So perhaps we could get our planning department next week to come as we rehear this back in committee. Other than that, though, be very supportive of it. Supervisor Peskin?
I was actually just going to say that I believe legal counsel has advised us that this will require a continuance, and depending on what happens in the intervening week, I think, out of an abundance of caution, trying to get this done sooner rather than later, could schedule it as a committee report for the 12th, if it is the committee's will to forward it out, subject to hearing more from the public. I do want to say that as Supervisors Kim and I were working with President Breed in and around the One Oak matter, that I was able to do a little bit of shuttle diplomacy from between the appellant, Mr. Henderson, and the project sponsor and President Breed, because it's in her district. And I do want to say that Mr. Henderson, I think, is supportive. I don't want to put words in his mouth, and he has another week to weigh in with all of us, but is supportive of the item with the amendment that I introduced on Supervisor Kim's behalf. And he said I could say that, so I did.
Okay. With that, we have a motion to Supervisor Breed. Sorry.
Thank you. I just want to thank everyone for coming out, and also many of the folks who we worked with on the issues around the appeal for One Oak, members of the Hayes Valley Neighborhood Association, including the president, Gail Baugh, and I know Jason Henderson wasn't able to make it today, but I just wanted to express exactly my understanding of and feeling of exactly why I know the community is against parking. I know people think, well, why is parking such a big deal, and why are we putting parking above housing? And that's not the case. I think the bigger issue here is we have an area that clearly is going to have thousands of additional units, an area that's already congested. And the point of putting some controls on this is to just eliminate the ability for developers to get additional parking for their projects. And I appreciate Supervisor Kim's concern about, larger projects that are in the pipeline and the desire to have those projects build on site and not use the ability not to have the option of a CU for additional parking as an excuse to maybe fee out. It's a complicated issue. It's not as if by adding this particular amendment we're suggesting in any way that someone's just going to automatically be able to get additional parking space. There's still a CU process. It still could be appealed and potentially to the board. And I just want to, I get the desire of the community to say, look, this is our volunteer time. We're volunteering our time to come to the Board of Supervisors for legislation like this. We're volunteering our time to appeal things like this. We're volunteering our time because we care about the community, and we don't want to see additional congestion as a result of development, additional parking, and a number of other things. I totally get that. I understand that. And as a way to work with my colleagues and come up with a solution, this particular amendment was proposed. I'm definitely open to hearing from members of the public in terms of their feedback on their concerns about this, but I do think there's still a layered process that will still make this a difficult thing to do moving forward, whether they choose to do on-site affordable housing or not. It'd be interesting to know what specific projects in the pipeline are being proposed that have maybe an interest in doing this, and whether or not those are projects that we would anticipate a larger percentage of affordable housing as a result of their desire to want additional parking. So I think there's definitely more of a discussion to be had here. And since this item is going to sit for a week and be reviewed by my colleagues next week, I'm sure that'll give everyone additional time to, of course, submit emails to us and then also come back to provide public comment at the Land Use Committee next week. So again, thank you all for being here, and I appreciate my colleagues' support on the amendment that I proposed.
Okay, thank you. So again, Supervisor Peskin's made the motion to accept Supervisor Breed's and then the follow-on amendment from Supervisor Kim. And then Supervisor Peskin, could I add on then to continue this item as amended for 1 week till next week's Land Use Committee meeting? And Supervisor Peskin has made that motion, then we can take it without objection. Thank you. Madam Clerk, would you call item number 4?
Item number 4 is an ordinance amending the Transportation Code to change the term car share vehicle to share vehicle and permit shared vehicles to park in designated spaces and making appropriate findings.
Mr. Thornley, welcome back in your
Yes.
role as a city official this time, I believe.
Thank you. Andy Thornley back from lunch. Sustainable Streets, SF Municipal Transportation Agency. Committee members, we are asking for the Board of Supervisors' assistance in amending Division 1 of the Transportation Code. Very minor language change, even more minor than the shared moped change we just brought. And I would be happy to give you as much background as you want, but the matter before you is to amend Section 7.2.52 of the Transportation Code, which is the infraction for parking a non-permitted vehicle in a designated car share parking space. The change that we're asking for is to strike the word car and put a D after the word share, because the MTA has decided, we think it's a good idea, we're beginning to move to talking about shared vehicles rather than car share, and in changing the nomenclature we realized we were bumping into this infraction. So the full essence is only that one word and one letter. Again, I'd be happy to give you as much background as you'd like.
Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Chair Farrell. And I don't think this is really relevant to the amendment that's being requested today, but gets to one of the underlying issues about the pilot program. In the MTA's letter of August 28th, with regard to this matter, it says on the first page, based on the pilot experience, the SFMTA found that only shared managed fleet vehicles produced enough public benefit to justify use of the public right-of-way. Where does that standard come from, and is it applied to other transportation-related uses in the public right-of-way?
Thank you, Supervisor. What that's speaking to is, and I think District 3 is painfully aware of this, that in the pilot program we had 3 car sharing organizations qualified to participate: City Car Share, Zipcar, and Get Around. Get Around is a different sort of car share operator, peer-to-peer. I often say it's like the Airbnb of car share, which you can take in a couple of different ways.
I thought they were aptly named because they were getting around the law, but go ahead.
Right.
Or the intent of the law, anyway.
So for the committee and folks watching at home and elsewhere, the peer-to-peer car share concept is that many San Franciscans own a vehicle and use it very little. The average U.S. car is sitting idle most of the time. And Get Around has made a business out of being sort of a broker. And they will take your car, your idle, underused car, and find multiple other folks to use it. And when it works well, you've got a car being used by 10 or 12 or 20 or 30 neighbors, much more utility from a single car, a car that's already going to be parked in the neighborhood. But it can also go in other directions, and we've seen cases where cars are put on the street and basically grazed as milk cows on Russian Hill or other neighborhoods. And more to the point, whereas a fleet car share organization like Zipcar has no interest in having a car idle or having a piece of space leased out, Get Around, because they don't own cars, don't have as much of an incentive to make sure that that space is being maximized for its utility. They're interested in align with the MTAs as closely as Zipcar or City Car Share in terms of, are we really getting good use out of that 20 feet of curb on Russian Hill or in the Outer Sunset or wherever? And both from the underutilization of the 20 feet, and because Get Around is putting just private citizens' cars on the street, it's kind of a random supply. We saw one week there would be a monster truck, the next week there'd be a Mini. The neighbors need to be able to rely on there's going to be a four-door sedan there, and I can count on it being clean and ready to go. And Get Around just was not able to meet that level of utility and that amount of sharing.
Mr. Thornley, I appreciate your analysis of the different business models, but I'm really asking, is there an objective numerical standard for establishing what is enough public benefit to justify the use of the right-of-way? Let me tell you where I'm going. Where I'm really going is the recently announced plan to designate public curb spaces as TNC loading zones. And what I'm really asking is, do you think your agency believes that Uber and Lyft produce enough public benefit to justify the use of curb space as it pertains to the mayor's recently announced proposal? That's where I'm really going. So there's two questions.
Got it.
Objective numerical standard for what triggers public benefit, and do you think Uber and Lyft in this scheme meet that criteria?
Right. Well, I'll take the first one, which is a little more in my responsibility area, that the pilot that we ran for a couple of years was looking at some fixed measures for a given space. How many unique users each month? How many reservations per day? How far did it go? And on that basis, Zipcar of the three knocked it out of the park. They had cars that were being used by 50 and 60 different people in a month. So we didn't come in with an absolute metric on that, but you could see from the field of participants that if Zipcar can get 60 different people using a car, other folks had better match that. We don't yet have an absolute threshold for that, but we are going to be developing them for this program because it's an important point. And we figured that probably depending on which neighborhood, if you're farther out, it may be a lower threshold than if you're on Russian Hill. So short answer to the first, yes, we have general hard numbers on that. We're going to be putting more hard numbers on this on-street shared vehicle program. Your second question is a little tougher for me to answer. And in responsibility, I can't say yes or no that I don't have access to that. I will speculate, however irresponsibly, that at this point, no, the MTA does not have a metric to evaluate whether a given piece of loading curb is at, below, above some standard for utility and public benefit. The mayor's TNC pilot, as I have read about it in the newspaper, is reaching at that, but it's not starting with here is what success looks like as much as is there a way that we can address this and make sense out of it. So I don't have access to all the thinking on this. My understanding is that it's the beginning of a reach at could we do something to make it less bad rather than saying here's what good looks like and can we hit that point.
No, I appreciate that candid answer, and I guess I would just suggest, in using item number 4 as a forum to have this conversation, that insofar as the pilot that you were in charge of that we're discussing today has given some data and shown what the gold standard looks like and what the get-around standard looks like when it's not working optimally, perhaps there can be some communication between you and your staff and the folks who are reaching or overreaching in the Uber-Lyft matter.
Yes, absolutely. I will not just take that back, but I will guarantee. I think that, again, this is speculative, but I don't think it's possible that the MTA is going to participate in a pilot such as the one that we're talking about with the TNCs without setting some evaluation planning and deriving some data. And I know that you and other folks are going to want to know, what did you learn? Where did the meter go? It won't just be, let's put out curb and hope that it works. I wouldn't want that, and I'll work from my side to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Mr. Thornley.
Okay, colleagues, any further questions? I don't believe we've gone to public comment yet, so we'll go to public comment. Anybody wish to comment on item 4? Seeing none, public comment's now closed. Colleagues, any questions or comments or a motion to move this item forward?
I'll move it.
Okay, motion by Supervisor Peskin, and we can take that motion without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thornley. All right. We're on to item number 5. Oh, surprise, surprise. Okay, Madam Clerk, would you call item number 5, please?
Item number 5 is a hearing to examine the past 10 years of the production, funding, and preservation of workforce and middle-class housing, and examine the projected development and preservation for the next 10 years, focusing on housing between 55 to 175% area median income.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Colleagues, this hearing was sponsored by Supervisor Safai, who has just joined us in committee. So, Supervisor Safai, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for scheduling this item. I know how busy the agenda is moving into the holiday season. But on October 3rd of this year, before we get to the presentation by the departmental staff, October 3rd of this year, I called for this hearing to talk about workforce and middle-class housing in our city. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that in particular, and to talk about what the projected development was and the preservation was, and what had been done over the last 10 years, is because it's become extremely and glaringly obvious to this body and to many members of the public and many interested parties around San Francisco that our city is polarizing. Many would argue that we've done a significant job of building enough market rate housing, but the statistics would say that there's still a lot of demand out there for that housing. Same with regard to low-income housing, we still have a lot more work to do, but relative to many parts of California and probably most cities in California, we've done exceedingly well, but we still have a significant amount of work to do. But in the area of households between 55% and 150, 175% AMI, or so-called workforce and middle-class housing, we've done extremely, extremely poor. And one of the reasons why is that our market in San Francisco has always taken care of that housing stock in the private sector on its own. Places like the Excelsior, the Richmond, the Sunset, Bayview Hunters Point have always been areas, and many more, have always been areas of San Francisco that took care of working and middle-class families. And this, in many ways, this hearing is a continuation of the conversations that we began at the beginning of the year to discuss inclusionary housing. And the focus of that was really about what are we doing to really expand and really fill in the gaps where the so-called missing middle, or the middle and working class families on top of low income, are being left out of the conversation. When the Excelsior, Bayview Hunters Point, the Richmond, the Sunset homes are going far north of $1 million, we know that we are extremely in a crisis in this city, as well as evictions, low-income housing households having to compete against. Obviously that's something that's very, very well documented. But this part of the conversation is not so documented. It hasn't been in the forefront of the conversation. So we're going to hear today from the Planning Department, the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, and the Comptroller's Office, and our economist, Ted Egan. Just a few facts for the general public and for this body, just to remind them. San Francisco is the second most densely settled city in the United States after New York City, only after New York City. We're close to 18,000 people per square mile, and New York City is far north of 23,000, 24,000. The only thing that confines us are our borders, and the only room to grow for housing in general is urban infill and density and height. In general, I believe, and we'll hear this from the economist, the average median income household, one bedroom, was almost $3,700 a month, $3,600 a month. And people and families and housing costs are displacing our working and middle-class families at an alarming rate. And we're talking about janitors, nurses, teachers, firefighters, those that get up and make this great city work and are the backbone of this city on a daily basis, but are now being forced to commute on a farther and farther commute on a daily basis. You're going to hear things about the Regional Housing Need Allocation, or RHNA, and those are the areas that I think we're going to focus on today in terms of our shortcomings. But this crisis in middle class and working housing is not just confined to San Francisco, but is a Bay Area problem. I think we learned recently for the first time this year that not only is our missing middle being underserved, but for the first time, a family of four making over $100,000 a year is now defined as low income by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And that is alarming. So because of all these reasons and because of the idea of wanting to know what we've done and what we intend to do, I called for this hearing, and I want to start to think about solutions. I want to think about what ideas we might have and what need there is to be filled, and how we can begin to serve working and middle-class families better through our housing policies. So thank you, Mr. Chair. The order of people that we're going to call up today are Sarah Dennis Phillips from the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, Ted Egan from the Controller's Office, and then Josh Schwitzky from Planning. So, Sarah, if you can please come up and begin. If you have something to hand out, thank you.
Good afternoon, supervisors. Thanks for having us today. I'm Sarah Dennis Phillips from the Office of Economic and Workforce, appropriately enough, Workforce Development. I'm joined by my colleagues from the Office of Economic Analysis in the Controller's Office, from the Planning Department, and from the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. We're here to give you an overview of the workforce and middle income problem, the production, and the funding, creation, and preservation of those types of units over the past decade. To give you an overview of what we'll be talking about today, we're going to go over income levels and who are we really talking about when we talk about workforce and middle income households. We're going to go over economics and why those kind of households actually need housing support. We're going to go over our production, as the supervisor referenced, and look at how much we are building. And we're going to go over our programs to look at what tools we have to produce middle income housing. So while the federal and state government have many terms to try to define households by income, workforce housing, neither workforce housing nor middle income housing is one of those terms. So as we try to define it for our own purposes, we're looking at a couple of facts. One, the majority of San Francisco's existing affordable housing production and programs focuses on what we deem very low income households, generally households earning 60% of area median income or below. The majority of federal and state subsidy that we receive also addresses that same very low income range of households. And accordingly, most housing organizations across the state and even outside the state define workforce housing as homes aimed at households earning more than 60% of the area's median income. So for the purposes of this hearing, we're going to look at when we speak of workforce and middle income, we'll be looking at everybody making above that 60% area median income threshold. Those are all the households that aren't making enough to afford a home in San Francisco, but that are locked out of the majority of our housing programs. So who are those households? They're shown on this slide. The breadwinners can be anyone from a receptionist or an entry-level teacher all the way up to a medical assistant or engineers. Some of these households have children, some don't. All of them have trouble affording housing in San Francisco. Last week, Pedro Peterson from the Planning Department was before this committee giving information on current housing costs. He used a ballpark average of about $4,200 a month as the current average asking rent for a two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. And I think what's interesting about that, particularly as Supervisor Safi references our history and when certain neighborhoods would provide workforce housing, we're not seeing very much variation in new asking rents from neighborhood to neighborhood. And that's something that happens again and again when we're in a hot housing market. While we do have more and less expensive areas, it really flattens out when we're in a high demand period, which we are right now. The number 4,200 comes from Zillow's rent index. It's a date as of October 2017. And what does it mean in terms of households? You've probably heard that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of your income on rent. That's ideal. It's not really possible in San Francisco. Landlords here look to see that you can pay at least 40, that your annual income is at least 40 times the monthly rent. So if we use 40% of a household's annual income, one would need to earn at least 160% of the median income to be able to comfortably afford today's asking rents. So we're looking at everybody on down from 160% of median income as being cost burdened. And you can see the
Could I
figures
just
on
ask a
this house.
clarifying question? You just mentioned 40 times your monthly rent. You meant 40% of your annual income, right?
This math was not my strong suit. Thank you.
No.
for that correction.
There are always different standards in this city, but I just want to make sure. Okay.
Yes,
thanks.
that is absolutely right. That
All
would
good.
be astronomical.
It would be.
Similarly, for home prices, we're in an even worse situation. Zillow's index listed the midpoint home value in October as $1,249,000. While home affordability depends on more than just income, it includes obviously things like mortgage rates, down payment availability, et cetera. You can safely say that a household will need to earn well over 200% of median income with an annual salary of at least $225,000 for a three-person household to be able to afford a home in today's market. And unsurprisingly, as you also heard from Pedro last week, even as our overall population has increased, and as we've seen increases in very low and in upper income households since 1996, we've lost households earning between 30 and 140% of median income. I think it's pretty clear we are losing middle income households as a result of our high housing costs. And with that, I will turn it over to Ted Egan from the Comptroller's Office.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, Supervisors. Ted Egan from the Comptroller's Office. I'm going to, I think, emphasize some of the same points that Sarah's just made that Supervisor Safai opened hearing with, to talk about the role that middle-income households play in San Francisco and the sort of economic cost that are associated with the problems, the housing problems that are particular to that group. Sarah had just talked about the trends, and this is a chart that shows the trends in household income over the past 20 years or so in San Francisco from 1990. What it really shows is that there's a widening inequality within San Francisco. The percentage of households that are 50% or below has grown since 1990. The percentage of households over 150% has grown. The group in the middle is stagnating or declining. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. But I would say that this is occurring at the same time as major changes in the economy in which we're seeing a relative slowdown or decline in traditional middle-income industries that provide jobs for middle-income people, both in San Francisco and across the region. So it's sort of setting the stage of the problem that Supervisor Safai was alluding to. It's not a new thing. It hasn't just happened in the last few years. It's been several decades brewing. This is a chart that shows the labor force participation rate of working age adults of different income groups in San Francisco. And I've circled that kind of middle income group that we were talking about in the 60 to 140% range. I should say, first of all, that San Francisco is one of those places where the labor force participation is extremely high. You'll see most of these groups, over 80% of the working adults are working or looking for a job. The national number is in the low 60s. The middle income group is sort of the group that is clearly part of the workforce in the sense that an extremely high percentage of working age adults are in the workforce. When you start talking about low-income groups, yes, there are many people working in low-income groups as well, but it's a much more heterogeneous group, and the labor force participation rate for low-income folks is considerably lower than middle income. In fact, the middle-income labor force participation rate is actually higher than it is for both the lower-income group, below 50%, but also to the extreme right of this chart, it's higher than it is for people over 250% of AMI. They also have a lower labor force participation rate than our middle-income households. So it's very clearly we're talking about the workforce when we're talking about middle-income housing. But at the same time, we're talking about housing problems that other segments in the workforce don't share. This is a chart that shows the same breakdown of San Francisco households by their income group, a kind of fine-grained, every 10% look at AMI. But this is the percentage of households in that group that are housing burdened, that are currently spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And of course, for low-income households, it's an extremely high number. For middle-income households, it's also quite a high number, and it's quite a bit higher than it is for the upper-income groups that are another part of the labor force. So really, when we're talking about middle-income households in San Francisco, we're talking about the group that is both a core part of the labor force, but also experiencing, in some cases, really dramatic housing burdens that the recent housing price escalations we've seen this decade are not helping, as the numbers Sarah just alluded to are highlighting. This is a chart that shows where San Franciscans residents who work, the industries that they work in, and it breaks them out by household income. The industries that are to the left of this chart have proportionally the most adults from middle-income households. And so it's really the industries that these folks are concentrated in within San Francisco. And it's a combination primarily of industries that, as I said, have been struggling for some time, like some of the blue-collar industries like warehousing and wholesale trade, but also industries that the city absolutely has to have. This is education and health services, public administration, as well as some sectors that tend to be pretty resilient, like the tourism industry and the construction industry. I wanted to just close with kind of another highlight. I've been talking a lot about the long-term trends related to middle-income housing, but I came across this report just last week that is a snapshot of where the skill shortages are in our regional economy today that really highlight, I think, the economic costs of the middle-income housing problem. We've, as everyone knows, gone through 6 or 7 years of really rapid growth in the technology industry in our region. That period seems to have reached a pause. Year over year, we have less tech jobs than we did a year ago. And what LinkedIn is saying in the column on the left is, if you have tech skills, you're not being hired, basically, at this point. These skills are in abundance in the labor market, and all of the top 10 least scarce skills in San Francisco and the Bay Area are the kind of tech skills that were very much in demand 3 or 4 years ago. Conversely, the skills that employers want to hire now, when tech employment has kind of stalled, are really the set of skills that are associated with middle-income households. It's things like education and teaching, and sales, and retail store operation, and working in logistics, and marketing event management. The challenge that these businesses have is going to be finding people to take these jobs, given the housing situation that faces middle-income folks in San Francisco and in our region. And the concern here is that if we don't address this problem, the economic good news that is certainly still continuing for the city turns into a situation in which these jobs simply can't be filled here, and they grow in other places instead, to the extent that they can, and we see even more distortion and unbalancing in our local economy. So I just wanted to say that there are a lot of reasons to tackle the middle-income housing problem. I just wanted to highlight some of the economic issues or the broader economic implications of it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Joshua Switsky with planning staff. I'll just take you briefly through some statistics on actual housing production and the various targets that we have set for us by the state. So first, we'll talk a little bit about RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and these are what the state sets for each jurisdiction on a cycle that at this point is about every 8 years. And this series of bars shows you how we've fared the last 3 cycles going back to 1989. The dark bar are the actual targets, minimum targets set by the state, and then the lighter bar is San Francisco's actual production over that time, broken out by the 4 different categories that the state sets for us. As you may or may not be able to discern from these colors, the green bar, the moderate income, is definitively the least served. That's in terms of San Francisco's performance over this period. In 1995, at the end of that period, we had built 12% of the minimum target. In 2006, it was 13%. And in 2014, we had built 19% of the moderate income need, the green bar. And then the notable upward shift there is primarily as a result of adopting inclusionary requirements in San Francisco just after the turn of the 21st century, which is why that green slice has slightly ticked up. But nonetheless, you can see that both the green and the red are the least served income levels. And this chart sort of aggregates the last two cycles into one chart, 1999 through 2014. And as a percentage, both the low 50 to 80% and moderate 80 to 120% are definitely the least served need in terms of our accomplished housing production. Of the low, we only met 30%, and of the moderate, we met only 15%. And you can see that contrasts with the other two ends of the spectrum. This is also a good time just to point out some of the flaws just in shortcomings of RHNA in and of itself. Because RHNA it's often misconstrued as goals or maximums. RHNA is really minimum targets, and they're each income is really independent of each other. And so, just looking at this chart, it suggests that we so-called overproduced at the high end. But what RHNA doesn't do is actually reflect real actual trends over the course of that period, and it's sort of a projection in time, only accommodating for growth and not accommodating for what it would take to bring down housing prices, or even reflecting what actually happens during that period. And so, while according to RHNA, we produced more than our minimum target for above moderate, what actually happened during this period was that we grew by tens of thousands of more high-income households than we produced market rate housing for, and the result was a substantial pressure on the existing housing stock and those lower income groups. This chart shows you where we sit in our current cycle. We're only a couple years into the current cycle, so it's it's a little hard to gauge what the final outcome will be. But you can still see from this chart that both the low and the moderate, the workforce housing targets are suffering the least in terms of actual production. And so, as Ted showed you, the impact of all this is that in terms of households, what households are we losing? Definitely the 50 to 120 tranches. The city has lost tens of thousands of households in these buckets over the last 25 years, while the lowest income households at 50 and less has been relatively stable over this time, and the above middle over 140 has grown as a share and overall. In terms of my last slide, in terms of the building pipeline, we have an unprecedented housing pipeline of over 60,000 units in the pipeline. Of those, about 14 to 15,000 are in a state of being built or having their permits issued. About half are entitled and not yet at that stage, and that includes a lot of our big master plans like Hunters Point Shipyard and Treasure Island, Park Merced, Pier 70, and those, which will come over the course of multiple decades. And then we have over 17,000 units currently under review. And so it's a little early for us to say yet exactly how this is going to break out in terms of incomes. We know that there's a minimum 10,500 units of affordable housing in this bucket, but there's certainly going to be more depending on how things shake out between inclusionary and other agreements over time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amy from OCD.
Thank you, and I forgot to mention Amy Chan from the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development as well.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Amy Chan from the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. I am going to be presenting on what existing tools the city has in serving middle-income households. This is a priority for our office, and we share the urgency that Supervisor Safai, that you have expressed in meeting the housing needs of this missing middle. Our office funds and oversees compliance of a number of programs that serve households at the 60% of AMI and above that Sarah mentioned before. This includes funding new and construction affordable housing rental projects, preserving existing rent-controlled housing through our small sites program, and providing home ownership loan assistance to middle-income households. And we also oversee the city's inclusionary program, which provides both on-site rental and home ownership units. So before I go into the specifics of these programs, I want to give you an overview of what funding sources our office has in serving middle-income households, and also what the implications are in terms of constraints for expanding what we can do. So the two primary sources of funding that we rely on to serve households above 60% of AMI are the Housing Trust Fund and the 2015 Housing Bond. The Housing Trust Fund allows us to serve households at up to 120% of AMI for production and rehab of affordable housing. We do set aside 10% of those funds for small sites preservation. The Housing Trust Fund also allows us to fund down payment loan assistance for first-time home buyers, and there is specifically funds set aside for first responders and educators. For first responders, the AMI level does go up to 200% of AMI. And then for the 2015 housing bond, this was a source that allowed us to really focus on middle-income households. We're serving 120 to 175% of AMI households. $80 million specifically in the bond was set aside just for middle-income production and homeownership assistance. And again, the down payment assistance program also specifically has a set aside for educators. We are expecting some state funds to assist us in our local funds, but they won't be coming until 2019. Through this year's historic housing package legislation that was passed at the state level, we now have a new recording fee that can be used for rental and homeownership opportunities serving middle-income workforce households. And then through the state's 2018 housing bond, there's also funds that are allowed to be used for home purchase assistance and veterans home ownership assistance. So what does this mean in terms of creating more middle-income housing? So we, the city, we're carrying most of this funding obligation, and without any existing state or federal funds to help us in creating middle-income rental units. The tax credit program only allows us to apply tax credits to units that are serving households no more than 60% of AMI. So our city dollars, unfortunately, can't leverage federal tax credits to serve middle-income households. Our city bond, our Affordable Housing 2015 bond, we're also estimating that we'll be expending the funds from that by 2020. So we have limited city funds, and without state or federal assistance and without the use of federal tax credits, our city gap for producing middle-income units typically are about $100,000 higher than what we provide for low-income units. So these are the funding sources that we have, and this is the funding constraints that we're operating under. So what exactly are we doing right now with our sources of funds? There are two affordable housing rental projects that will serve middle-income households that are in our pipeline. That's 88 Broadway and educator housing at the Francis Scott Key Annex site. For 88 Broadway, we will have 15% of the units, or 21 units, set aside to serve up to 100 or 120% of the area median income. This project is funded with the middle income units of this project are funded with $9 million of Prop A funds, and construction for this project is estimated to start next year. And then for educator housing, 60% of the units, or up to 80 units, will serve middle-income households up to 130% of AMI. The middle-income units we are funding with $28.5 million of the Prop A funds, and construction for this project is estimated to start in 2019. We also have a small sites preservation program that allows us to fund the acquisition and rehab of rent-controlled units that are at risk of losing their affordability when owners either are Ellis acting residents or taking the units outside of rent control. And this program allows us to serve residents at an average of 80% AMI, going up to 120% of AMI. It's been a very successful program. We've been able to preserve 25 buildings, if you look at the map, across the city, with 146 residential units and 9 commercial units. We have 11 additional small sites that are in our pipeline to bring us up to a total of 245 units, 24 group housing units, and then 19 commercial spaces. Our homeownership assistance programs also allow us to provide a down payment assistance loan program to first-time home buyers. That's the DOLP program. This is a deferred loan program that we are providing to households up to 170% of AMI. In the last fiscal year, we've closed on 35 DOLP loans for households between the 80 to 120% AMI levels, and then 17 DOLP and first responders DOLP loans for households between the 120 and 175% AMI levels. Additionally, we have a forgivable loan program specifically for educators, and that's called the Teacher Next Door program, and we've been able to close on 6 TND loans for educators last fiscal year, serving up to households at 200% of AMI. I should also mention that last year we closed on 185 BMR ownership units, both for initial sale and resales, serving households between 80 and 120% AMI. And in this fiscal year, we are estimating that we should be administering another 132 below market rate or OCII ownership units, reselling 75 ownership units, and then closing on another 26 down payment assistant loans. And then other efforts to serve middle-income households, thanks to the leadership of this Board of Supervisors. Now with inclusionary legislation passed that expands household AMI served both at the rental units and the ownership units, we're going to be seeing new projects that will have units that are serving households up to 110% AMI on an average for the rental units, and then up to 130% AMI on average for the ownership units. And other city efforts, again, thanks to the leadership of this board, to serve middle-income households through the private market is incentivizing more below-market rate units to the Home SF program, as well as creating and legalizing accessory dwelling units to serve our working households. So as I mentioned, we do have limited resources, although we have some notable achievements in terms of what we've been able to accomplish, both in terms of providing homeownership assistance for first-time home buyers, moving forward with the educator housing project, and continuing to serve households, keeping households retaining their housing through the small sites program. Some of the next steps, really what we need to focus on is expanding our sources of income, sources of funding to serve these households. And 2 legislative proposals that we have in terms of getting additional funding include allowing the federal and state low-income housing tax credits to serve above 60% AMI. There are existing proposals to allow income averaging at 60% AMI and to go up to 80% AMI. This will allow us to get the federal tax credits and the state tax credits to also serve a higher income level. And then also currently our welfare tax exemption only applies for units up to 80% of AMI. If we were to be extending this property tax exemption for units up to 120% AMI, this will allow our projects to be able to leverage more debt, and it would reduce our city's gap funding for middle income units. So both of these legislative proposals will help, but certainly we need more assistance in terms of expanding our income sources to serve middle income households. And with that, I conclude my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Don't go away, because I want to ask you a couple questions here at the end. So just so we're clear, so a little understanding, a couple of the proposals. So support income averaging for tax credits. So is that something that needs to happen at the state level? Is that state legislation that would need to happen?
It would be state and federal. If we wanted to apply both state and federal income tax credits to go beyond the 60% AMI, we would need state and federal legislation.
Okay, and then the last one in terms of the property tax exemption, is that also state and federal?
It's at the state level.
Oh, this is a state level thing?
Yes, correct.
Is that legislation drawn, or is that something that's in discussion?
This is something that we are looking at and that we are proposing.
Oh, okay. And then just a couple clarifying questions. How much of the Prop C annual allocation goes towards middle incomes? I didn't see that in your presentation. So that's the Housing Trust Fund. So how much money from the Housing Trust Fund are you spending annually on middle income?
So the Housing Trust Fund specifically allows us to produce new housing and or preserve, rehabilitate existing housing for units up to 120% AMI. So we apply that to both our low-income production and for middle-income production, again, no more than 120% AMI. The only specific allocation that we have for the Housing Trust Fund is we are setting aside 10% of those funds for small sites preservation.
So really out of the Housing Trust Fund right now, the only thing that's really being done is small site acquisitions, about 10%.
Yeah.
And how much is that annually?
I can get those numbers for you.
Okay. And then the rest of it's going to rehabilitation.
New production and rehabilitation.
Okay, so 10% of the total number, which at some point is going to grow to about $100 million a year.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so that's one. And then you said $80 million for Prop A was dedicated toward middle income.
Correct.
And you added, and you listed out about $37 million that was already spoken for. Where's the other $43 million?
So they include, for the $80 million in middle income, that includes both production for the rental side as well as homeownership assistance. So that includes the DOLP and the T&D programs serving households up to 175% AMI.
So what about the project? You mentioned the project out in the Sunset, the teacher housing. Is that the one for 28 million? That's getting 28 million.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So the 43 million, the delta can't be going just to down payment loan assistance. So there's probably some other projects that you've in the pipeline. That
right now, we've done one issuance for the Prop A funds, and we've allocated those funds for both the teacher housing project and for 88 Broadway. And then on top of that, we have allocated funds for down payment assistance and the Teacher Next Door program. We will have two other issuances for the bond, so we haven't expended the 80 million.
So there's still more money that could be issued.
We're at the about 30-ish million.
Okay, and then we'll take public comment in a minute, but I wanted to call the economist and planning department back up because I didn't get, something wasn't 100% clear. Because in the production slide, you said what's going to be produced, but how many in that pipeline is actually for middle income? It doesn't really say, unless I'm missing it.
No, you're not missing it, Supervisor.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah, it's still a little too early to tell. We know of the units that are currently under construction or subject to some of our development agreements, what that is, but we haven't had a chance to break it down the entire pipeline at this time yet of the whole 60,000. Some of those we don't know because many thousands of those are in the process and they haven't had to declare yet, or haven't had to determine whether they're doing on-site, off-site, paying in lieu fees.
Okay. Well, it would be good as a follow-up to have an idea of, because I'll forget names, but I'll remember numbers. So if you once you have something, if you can give me a number of what we're expecting over the next number of years that are in the pipeline, that would be helpful.
We can do that for you.
And then there was another slide that you have on your RHNA targets, but it's hard to pull from that. What's the number that would be an appropriate number to fill the need? I mean, I guess it's a question for both you and for Ted in terms of that missing middle. What's a number that we should be projecting toward in terms of to meet some of the shortfall?
Well, if you're going strictly according to the RHNA targets, if you combine the 50 to 80 and 80 to 120,
Is that 4102 and the 4971?
Correct. So that's 9,000 units.
So we're about 9,000 units short.
For the current cycle.
For the current, and the current cycle is up to 2022.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, I don't have any additional questions right now. If it's okay with the chair, we can open up for public comment.
All right, we'll open up item number 5 to public comment. Anybody wish to speak on this item?
Please come forward. Sorry. Am I okay?
Supervisors, Michael Terrio, San Francisco Building and Construction Trades Council. I am, in a way, going to be very unhelpful in this because I'm simply going to reiterate the problem. For about a generation now, we have remarked on the outflow of our members from San Francisco. We have a consistent pipeline and have had a consistent pipeline now fairly formalized through City Build from underprivileged communities of San Francisco into our trades. And we watch those workers as they come to a certain point in their careers, complete their apprenticeships, achieve journey level status, and begin to look for better living situations for themselves and their families, look around San Francisco and not find those living situations here. But I think if anything, although that's anecdotal and we don't have statistics to show you the way that, the city family here does, if anything, the fact that we are hearing that same sort of concern from other occupations now tends to say that that problem is intensifying, if anything, and spreading itself to other parts of the economy. And you might say, well, why does San Francisco need construction workers in the same degree it needs teachers and firefighters and so on? Quite apart from the fact that you want to be able to call a plumber or an electrician if you need one. I will remind you that in situations such as San Francisco will inevitably face, it will be good to have folks here who know how to handle a cutting torch or do heavy rigging. And it would be good to have those folks living in San Francisco where they're close to where the situations will happen. So I ask you for your help in addressing this problem. I don't have any solutions for you, unfortunately. But again, I will reiterate the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, board members. Peter Cohen with the Council of Community Housing Organizations. Amy covered everything. I couldn't think of anything else in the suite of middle-income programs that we have. I had all my bullet points here. You must have stolen my notes, Amy. So that's really what we've done, and I think it's actually pretty impressive. But the difficulty we've always had over the years is the limits of resources to be able to spread thinner and thinner, but also the limitations of leveraging sources for certain missing middle incomes. And I think, Supervisor Safai, you know that. So there's no easy solutions out there. A couple of quick thoughts. We talk about missing middle, and it's a good narrative. I think we all believe in it. But there's a big difference when you run a span of, say, 60 or 70% AMI families up to 140 or 150% AMI. And different programs work well for different parts of that range. So I would just impress upon you to sort of think carefully about what parts of that you're trying to serve and which programs really work well. We've got a lot of trial and error. For example, Supervisor Saifi and Peskin, I think you know, during the inclusionary discussions, we really nailed on the ownership side the right AMI levels because, as our home ownership counseling organizations know, there's a great absorption of those entry-level ownership opportunities for families between 70 and 100% AMI. That's the sweet spot for those programs that's worked really well. It has not worked as well above and below that. So that's not to disparage those folks. It's just a reality of how the programs work best. And secondly is just to be very thoughtful about the both and versus the either or. This is both programmatic as well as political. Again, resources should be additive. We've been fighting for that for years, of always adding to the stack and not being tempted to sort of take from one to give to the other. And I think we're all beyond that, but just as a friendly reminder. Happy to work with you on more creative solutions, including legislatively.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello, Supervisors. Corey Smith on behalf of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. If I can get the overhead. This is how, just for the record, ABAG reports these RHNA numbers, and just to kind of give you an idea, you can see the 3 different periods over there, and then, I know we're talking about different AMI levels here, but historically that 80 to 100% number right there, from 8 to 18, and we are currently at 5%. So just really puts, hopefully, a fire under our butts in figuring this out and trying to make sure that we are finding solutions, both in the short term and in the long term. I completely agree with a lot of Peter's comments here. We need to find additional funding sources to get a lot of this stuff because we are drastically underproducing at all levels. I also want to say that while we do need to be aggressive in our short-term solutions. Thinking long-term isn't the worst thing in the world either. And in that same spirit, we want to do both at the exact same time. I want to take a couple quotes from the California Legislative Analyst Office reports on perspectives for helping low-income Californians. They talk about a couple of things, and we often debate this concept of filtering. But the report states that housing does become less desirable as it ages. The direct quote, housing that was likely considered luxury when it was first built declined to the middle of the housing market within 25 years. So I imagine, I know at least a couple of you have kids, 25 years from now, they might be looking to want to live here. So in the effort to make sure we have these short-term solutions, let's not forget to continue building the market rate stuff, because we do know that new housing construction does ease the pressure on low and middle income San Franciscans today by providing alternative options. I also, because I have a mic and 15 seconds left, want to state that the federal GOP Senate tax plan right now and a lot of our potential funding sources for this stuff is absolutely under attack, and highly encourage everybody to reach out through the California Housing Partnership Corporations and reach out to Senate House members in the House of Representatives.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, Laura Clark, YIMBY Action. I wanted to add a little bit more context to the RHNA numbers because those were developed when our jobs projections were low because we were having a jobs recession. And so it's important to realize that we shouldn't necessarily be pinning our goals just to the RHNA numbers. They should probably be about 4 times that. We should be thinking about when is housing affordable is when people are spending about 30% of their income on rent. And so our goals should be tied to our jobs housing balance. They should also be tied to the regional goals, that the entire region has fallen down, and maybe that means that we should do even more. We shouldn't be stubborn and say, well, other people haven't done their part, so we won't either. Actually, we should double down and say people are desperate. We should build as much housing as we possibly can. It's also really important to ask ourselves, are we going to subsidize all the way up to 150% of AMI as our only solution for middle income? That does not seem reasonable to me. I would love to repeal Prop 13 and spend all that money on middle income housing, but that is unlikely. And so if we as a city are saying the only way that middle income people are going to be able to hold on in this city is by us subsidizing middle income, then we are looking at a failure of public policy. We need to be building a lot of housing. We need to flood the market with housing, and we need to realize that where is the missing middle missing? It's missing in our outlying neighborhoods. It's missing where we have constrained what we are allowed to do by creating low-density neighborhoods. We used to convert single-family homes into apartments, and we now do not allow that to happen. The ADU legislation is a great start, but we need to upzone our neighborhoods. Glen Park, St. Francis Wood, the Richmond, all of these neighborhoods need to start building apartments. Those are less expensive. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Afternoon. My name is Georgia Shudish, and a couple of thoughts about how you could recapture housing. A vacancy tax, a luxury tax, that would give you money to produce more housing. A lot of people who own property don't like rent control, so they keep their property off the market. It's not right, but they do it. Is there a way to recapture some of that? Give a rebate for property tax, which everyone's downstairs paying now, for 5 years. How do you find out if someone's left a unit or a house or several units vacant? You can look at the water bill to see how much water usage has been there. I think you'd have access to that. Those are just some ideas. I mean, I've heard the stories for years that there's 5,000 rental units out there sitting empty. Maybe that's true, maybe isn't. It'd be nice to find out. Perhaps that would help the missing middle. That's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public wish to speak on item number 5? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed. Supervisor Safai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that I wanted to ask maybe the planning department, because I heard in a couple of different public comment that an idea, I mean, we have a certain amount of the funds set aside for acquisition and the small sites program and land, it would be good to know, based on census data, where some of the households are that are, you could map in, I'm sure you guys have already done that, where this missing middle or the middle income households are living, and begin to target. One of the slides showed where the small sites program is being utilized, and it was kind of concentrated in the center to the eastern part of the city. And I know that that's not necessarily where all of the, I mean, it's based on the design of the program, and we've started conversations with the Mayor's Office of Housing on that. We started that the other day about how we can tailor the program. Some of it's based on money, the amount of money that goes into, but I know the program sweet spot is 3-4 units and above. And so thinking about knowing where those households are would be helpful. The reason I pointed out and asked the questions about Prop A and Prop C were not to necessarily criticize the program. Those were hard-fought negotiations that said where the priorities were. And so it's clear about 10% of the Prop C funds are targeted toward middle-income households, and 80 million of Prop A is targeted toward middle-income households. But it shows that based on that 9,000 unit number that you've produced, that there needs to be strong consideration for additional sources of revenue to add to some of the public speakers' points. This is an addition to, not taking away of. So we're not going to refight any of those battles. We're talking about how we can expand the pie to do that. I just wanted to ask the economist to come back up to speak a little bit more, answer a couple questions. Mr. Egan. So one of the things that's talked about is one of your slides says the need is the one on where we have an abundance of the workforce and where we have a shortage of the workforce, or based on your projections. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask you to comment on that particular slide was, even if we do have an abundance in that particular arena, skill shortages, even if we do have an abundance and a shortage in some ways, speak a little bit more what that means in terms of the housing and how the connection of the housing, because even if we do have an abundance and there's that demand, I mean, one of the things I'm hearing from the industry that's represented in this in terms of the abundance of skills is that they're starting to come across a housing shortage that's making it harder to recruit in those areas, or at least retain the workforce in that area. So can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, I think that that's true. I mean, given how quickly housing prices have risen the last 5 years, companies' plans about recruiting from around the country, from around the world, to come to San Francisco have to change very dramatically. And there's some types of companies that are just not going to be able to pay the salaries sufficient to either attract people to move here to pay our housing prices, or attract the talent they need locally. I think the point about the tech industry today, though, is, yeah, it's growing slowly here, and costs are part of that, but it's slowing down across the country. It just seems to have sort of reached the end of one of its entrepreneurial cycles, and who knows what the future holds in that. But the point I just wanted to make with this slide is there is another piece of the economy, other types of companies, they need to hire people too. The particular challenge they have is virtually none of the jobs on the right-hand side of the slide pay the kind of salaries that the ones on the left. So they're going to have it much harder to recruit people to fill those jobs if the people are not already here in middle-income housing in San Francisco. In other words, trying to grow the amount of middle-income people here is the challenge because of the affordability problems that we've been talking about.
Right, and I appreciate Michael Terrio being here from the Secretary-Treasurer of Labor of the Building Trades. Worked with him, among many other people, in the labor community, and those, particularly in the service sector and in the trades, have seen their traditional neighborhoods where the housing was available to them, if they didn't purchase a home or weren't here 20, 30 years ago, the commute or the amount of housing available to them has shrunk and lengthened. The commute lengthening and the housing shrinking or disappearing completely. So that certainly says a lot about recruitment, retention, and serving an industry in industries that are vital to the economy in San Francisco.
I think it absolutely does. And for a long time, one of the saving graces of being in San Francisco, if you're a business, is the ability to draw in labor from all over the Bay Area. The problem is, to the extent we're seeing the same thing happening across the Bay Area, you're running out of neighborhoods around the Bay where you're able to find housing that's vacant, that's affordable for people in a lot of these middle-income occupations. So the phenomenon that we started to see in San Francisco, maybe in the early 1990s, I think this decade we're seeing more and more around the Bay Area. Yes, it's certainly true that one of the costs that gets imposed on middle-income people is a long commute, an increasingly long commute, now going into the Central Valley for a lot of people. But I think the more fundamental change is we stop to see these jobs in the Bay Area at all, just because the costs are prohibitive.
Well, certain sectors there will always be a need for. I mean, the hospitality industry, you have to have folks working in the hotels and the restaurants, and so the idea is, where does that workforce come from and where do they live?
Well, those businesses have to make it as businesses. I mean, the hotel rates in San Francisco are quite high. People are willing to pay a lot of money to San Francisco, and so that to some extent allows those businesses to support their workers. But there's a difference between, I think it's important to keep in mind in this, the people who have housing and the next generation. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons that the housing burden numbers that I showed before aren't as high as people might think is those are people who have been living in their house for a long time. If you owned your house for a long time or you've been in a rent-controlled house for a long time, your housing costs may be manageable, particularly if your income is going up as well. But trying to get someone to move to San Francisco and pay $3,700, or if their family changes and they need a bigger home or a smaller home, are they going to be able to find a place in the city or even nearby? I think that's the real challenge. So to some extent, industries that are competitive in the city, and we have a very strong tourism industry, can pay wages, but I wouldn't minimize the challenge that faces every industry in bringing new people and providing housing for the next generation of middle-income people.
So, I mean, we based on your statistics, we still rank at the top in terms of 1, 2, or 3 in terms of the price per rental unit or housing unit. Commute is factored in. When I think of the second, and the reason I brought up the point about San Francisco being the second most densely settled, I always relate it to New York, even though we're not on any way, shape, or form scale of New York City. But one of the things that New York City did 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago is they made a tremendous amount, and they made a significant investment in subsidized housing. And yes, I agree with some of the speakers that part of the solution is creating more, but there is that built-in percentage of their housing stock that is government subsidized or government owned. And that's a difference between San Francisco and New York City. And so one of the ideas, one of the things I've heard here today is that if you can begin to expand the volume of subsidized income-restricted housing or acquired housing, it can begin to change the course of the overall housing market.
I think if you can do that at scale, that's certainly true. New York City certainly did that in sort of the early post-war decade. They built a lot of housing, and a lot of it was subsidized. They had the same debates then we had now about, yes, there's a lot of new housing, but how much is it affordable for our workforce? But the main thing, I think, is they grew a lot. They built a lot of transportation. They built a lot of housing. And when you do things at scale and you subsidize at scale, yes, it can have a big impact on the housing market. You know, New York City was a very kind of comfortable middle-class city up until, say, the 1970s, 1980s, before it started getting the same kind of inequality that we see now in San Francisco.
Right. And this is not a phenomenon that's unique to San Francisco by any means. There's been a massive reurbanization of all of the major cities around the United States, at least on the two coastal cities.
Certainly there's a number of cities that have a similar pattern. The thing about San Francisco is our economy is so much hotter than those other places that it's probably worse here than any other place.
Yeah, and then our constraints. Again, that's why I brought up the 47 square miles versus some of these other places. So density and height have to be a part of the conversation if you want to get at this solution.
I would agree with that, and I would say it's probably more than 49 square miles. Only about 10% of the Bay Area lives in San Francisco. So there's no reason that 10% should see itself as 100% of the solution.
Right, but that's what we have control over.
Right.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I appreciate you taking the time. I would just close by saying it seems very apparent to me based on the numbers that one of the strongest solutions that we have is the and in terms of adding additional funding for this source. Just to reiterate for the record, we have the low-income housing tax credit goes up to those incomes up to 60% AMI. Prop C Housing Trust Fund, 90% was allocated to low-income households and low-income housing production as a way to fill the loss of redevelopment agencies. That was a number of people in the room, and others were involved in that campaign, and that was a big push in this city. And then Prop A, most recently, more was set aside for middle-income households, and I know we're going to have our first educator housing project, which is significant. But based on these numbers, it seems as though, so that's 3 or 4 different sources dedicated 80 to 90% for low income. So there seems to be a significant need, and based on this information, to push ahead on a conversation about how we can create new sources. I appreciate the presentation about some additional ideas in terms of property tax and averaging out with state and federal help, and happy to be involved in those conversations, particularly the ones we have a little bit more control over, which is at the state level. But who knows? Maybe we'll be surprised at the federal level too. I mean, it was Ronald Reagan that created the low-income housing tax credit program, but we had Tip O'Neill in Congress, and it was a very different day back then. So who knows if that's even something worth pursuing. It's a conversation to have. I know from being involved in a number of conversations, particularly one most recently, about the developer and the cost to developer for middle-income units versus low-income units. And it seems counterintuitive, but the tax credits and the tax exemptions that are given to low-income or allocated and designed for low-income units allow a private developer, give them more of an incentive or an ability or a subsidy to create those units versus this group that we're trying to target. At least in this conversation, the subsidy is not there, and so then it becomes more expensive to build those units in many ways, and with less return than a market rate unit. And that's what a lot of these investors and investments are based on. So we will continue this conversation. I appreciate the chair hosting this and moving this conversation forward, and we'll work with these departments and members of the public to further an idea on how we can create additional revenue for this much need. And I appreciate the departments for putting this together on such short notice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang.
Thank you. I just simply wanted to say, maybe even a year or two ago, it was actually very difficult to even have this conversation around middle-income housing. So I do want to thank Supervisor Safai and, of course, all of our city department staff for working on this, because it is a real issue. We have the data to show that this is an increasing problem, and we're not here to take away any additional housing from other people. We are trying to broaden the pot, as Supervisor Safai said. So I look forward to continue being engaged on this issue with all of you.
Thank you, Supervisor. Echo those comments as well. With that, Supervisor Tang, could I have a motion to file item number 5?
So moved.
Okay, motion by Supervisor Tang. We can take that without objection. Madam Clerk, do we have any other business in front of us?
That concludes our business for today.
Thank you, everybody. We're adjourned.